Thanks, Laura. This is going to be kind of informal, and we're going to traipse along and crisscross the line between intellectual conversation and a welcome party. A few years ago, when we polled faculty for titles for summer reading to send to incoming master's students, the one book that was on everybody's list was The Social Life of Things. And it's a title, of course, that's launched thousands of other titles. Just a few months ago, the New York Times Magazine cover was The Social Life of Forests. So things have spread out a little bit. But it's great for us to have the opportunity to talk to Arjun starting today, but for the years to come. And I think part of what I'd like to do is just, in some sense, get us the person behind the name and make that present. And the second is to offer Arjun a chance to take us on a trip from The Social Life of Things, which is now 30 years old, to today and the work that he's doing now, and by extension, what he'll be doing while he's with us. So let me just start, Arjun, with a question about The Social Life of Things, where that book came from at the time, it was 1986, and how you think about it now.
I think, first of all, thanks very much for enabling this occasion and enabling it in a manner that does not create extreme stage fright, as lectures and full perorations might. So thanks very much to all of you also for coming and joining this initiating ritual for me, which as an anthropologist, I always value and appreciate. So Social Life Things, I think the very specific trigger to this was a conversation in probably 1983 with a colleague who's actually in the collection, but alas, no longer alive, Igor Kopitov, who mentioned that he was beginning to think about things, cars and so on, as having, as he put it, cultural biographies. And that was the title of his own essay. And I think that was my first sense that things could be somehow mobile. And we began to talk and we conversed a lot. And that led to a year-long seminar of something called the Ethno History Workshop at the University of Pennsylvania. We invited a bunch of people, had a year-end conference, some of which became the content of the book Social Life of Things. And I'll say only one other thing, which might open up the ground for where I think that set of questions might be today for me or for others, that when we had the conference, I realized cultural biographies of things like this watch or this mug are already very interesting, but that there is something we may call the social life, which is somehow bigger and more general. How do mugs in general evolve, for example? No biography of this mug is going to tell you how, in the civilizing process, mugs become ways to drink. That's just not going to happen. So you have to think at two levels. And so I thought the social life was somehow broader, but of course included the cultural biography or the individual story. So that's the origin story. Since then, the journey has gone through many iterations, and it's in a somewhat different place today, but maybe I'll leave that open to say that's where it began. One conversation with one colleague in the coffee room, which at the University of Pennsylvania, the University Museum, was called the Potlatch. So that's my origin story.
Right. But how does that project look to you now? Do you look back on it and feel like it's been a unanticipated remarkable success and anticipated remarkable success? Or do you feel, in fact, that some parts of the initial message have gotten lost in the transmission over the decades?
Well, yeah. So it's a mixed thing. I mean, first of all, no one in my position could be anything other than grateful for the fact that the book struck a chord in so many disciplines. And I still am blown away by the fact that people from religious studies and philosophy through to material culture and art history and cultural studies and lit studies, there's no, and then more special fields like sports studies, there's, all sorts of strange, have found the book useful, have bought it, have taught it, and so on and so forth. So that's, and that continues. So the book continues to sell in one or other version. It's been translated widely. And those translations also tend to continue to provoke discussions and debate. So no one, and certainly not I, could fail to be proud and humbled by that. That said, if I took a hard look at what did that book deliver and signal, and what is the status of that, let's say, message or finding or approach now? What I would say is, on the one hand, what was a move from being not on the aircraft at all to being an economy was what that book did. In other words, the question of objects having some form of movement, which is vital to them, was not even boarded. And that book boarded that idea. Since then, there's been a rush to business class with, picking some names randomly, Latour, Stengers, this one, that one. There's a veritable industry for whom the idea that objects have agency has become very central to what they have to say, actor network theory, blah, blah, blah. That set of developments are viewed with some ambivalence because they seem to me to, first of all, they are rather light on acknowledging predecessors. Herr Bruno, high in that list. Who knows when he began to think about this stuff and what there was around, but this might be called a minor quibble of the academic about his own work. But there's that, which is what happens when there's a scramble to business class, that economy is economy, So further though, I think there's been the shortest way I'll put what the cost has been, because there have not been many. I mean, mostly people are learning from the book, using the book in wonderful ways, which always are eye-opening to me. But at the high altitude end, I would say the cost is a kind of move from epistemology or method to ontology. So all of a sudden, things really move. Mars really wants something, and so on and so forth. My feeling is, well, Mars may want something, but my chance in my lifetime of knowing what Mars wants is slender. But I can act as if Mars has, motivations, agency, that's helpful. But to make it part of the order of things, which I think is the big change in media studies, in science and technology studies, in other things, exerts a cost, which is that you suddenly lose the sense that this observation is a methodological fiction, which can be very fruitful. By turning the fiction into fact, you take on a huge philosophical burden, and I'm not sure what the payoff is. Anyway, I leave it with that hermetic observation.
Okay, that's an interesting one to take up later. But I hadn't thought about this before. Can you say something about what the translations of the book have done in the different language cultures in which the translation appeared. I mean, is there a global discussion of things, or are there many, many different discussions of the social life of things?
Yeah, good question, Peter. It's hard for me to say because most of those languages I don't read. French I read, for example, a little bit, but Portuguese I don't, and Arabic I don't, and certainly the East Asian languages, Japanese, Chinese, I have no idea. So there I face the problem of which we all face, which is a limitation in our own grasp of numerous or multiple languages. So my symptom of what's happening is what I hear from people who then write dissertations because they read the book in Portuguese or Spanish or Arabic or Japanese. So it's a secondary, sometimes tertiary symptom of what the reading might be. And while there are occasionally indicators, unsurprising indicators, that people pick up things that are very vital in their environments, violence, for example, or colonialism, for example, or commodification, for example. While that sort of thing is discernible, I think what is more discernible, you might say strangely, for a book which is entirely and obsessively cultural in its perspective, is that the importance of the thingness of things is clear to everyone in some manner. So there's an odd universality in the interest in the book. Everybody's surrounded by things. Everybody realizes they carry some weight. So they don't have to be heavily invested in Marx or Morse or anthropology or this or that to say, wow, yeah, things are more interesting than I thought, and they surround me. So I think there's something very general. I won't say universal, but very general in the intrigue with the book, which also has to do, I think, with the variety of its examples. So if I'd written a monograph droning on about my views, I think, it would have died a peaceful death, a little while after. But because it has those 10 or 11 essays about carpets and relics and so on, I think the uptake was richer just because people had different ports of entry.
Do you think it also benefited from, in some sense, the non-ideological character, that it wasn't a kind of dogmatic preaching over and above the different contributors? I mean, it popped into life at a moment anyway when the power of Marxian analysis was waning, and the development of the scholarship on consumption was taking some of that energy. So was it also something to do with the ideological moment that has given it this kind of opportunity?
It could be, but when you think about the mid 80s, let's say 86, it's a difficult moment to name because it's not 68, it's not 89, it's not this, it's not that. So it's not that people immediately say, oh, 86, yeah, I remember that year, either musically or academically. But if you think of the period, I would say, yes, it's a period when intimations of the end of an older order of things were already there. I mean, I always like to remind people that Rajiv Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, was already talking about digitality and what was going to happen in the 20th century and so on, well before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and saying India should go into digital technology, should do this and that and the other, and he was not a genius. He was just, an important figure in a large country. So I do think, and he was, his period was in the mid 80s before he sadly got assassinated. That's an example of something afoot in the world, which I would say was, incipient. And the question what that was is very tough to name now because its names become fixed once the child appears. It's globalization, it's the democracy, it's this, it's that. But at that time, there was a sense of a pregnancy without a nameable issue. And I think that book caught some of that uncertainty, and its non-dogmatism, I think, which of course, I'm still somehow in that space of thought and habit. But I think the external thing was that allowed for that openness of what might issue to be picked up, so that we didn't already have a script, and whether it was, and the book, and my introduction especially, firmly is placed in the kind of tension between Marx and Mauss. Mauss is all solidarity, collectivity, Durkheim, gift. Marx is all suspicion, levels, power. And the introduction oscillates between them and refuses, in a way, to say, well, I declare the man in the blue trunks the winner. And I think that was helpful to people at a moment when these big debates were about to become open debates again.
Right.
So that's a kind of a reading.
That's really interesting. I want to ask you the obvious question about, well, can you connect the dots from that book, which we all know, through some of your other later works, which we may not know as well here. But I also then realized that, I should give you the option of saying, actually, that's not the way my career went. There isn't an obvious connection. So can you answer both of those questions, the connecting the dots, and then whether you as a scholar believe that your own career has been a connecting the dots?
So as to the second question, I can only respond with a joke, which is a serious joke, though. From my transformative few but precious interactions with the great Hannah Arendt, an important figure, of course, to Bard as a whole. And in one of her lectures or tutorials, which I was physically present at, she was talking about, I think it was her lectures on the will. And in this case, the question was about necessity. And she said, with her fabulous, charismatic, heavily German accent, she said, the past, and we were all like, the past appears under the guise of necessity. So I've remembered every word of that. The past appears under the guise of necessity. Therefore, I bring up this anecdote, which has always stayed in my mind, to say that my biography to me may appear under the guise of necessity, but I'm sure at turn after turn, it's been not only path dependent, as the social scientists may say, but the product of, the ruthlessness of context, as Thompson said, or the complete savagery of contingency. Things happen, including shit, as people say. So I resist the temptation to see in my career some kind of clear thing. That said, I think anyone involved in the mental life or in the scholarly life, the life of ideas, and has stuck there for a long time, would be wrong to deny that there must be some governing obsessions. That doesn't mean that there's a script then, and there were stars above the stable in Bethlehem when you were born that pointed to the social life of things and after. Clearly not, but there are some guiding things you keep returning to. As a wonderful young architectural critic who passed away far too young said in a journal called Architectural News of New York, ANNY. It was a remarkable avant-garde journal for a few years. He had a whole issue or an article called X Marks the Spot. And it was about buildings, spaces. And I think this X marks the spot is a way to think about those driving obsessions for any of us that to which we keep returning. That is the scene of the crime. But it's not about crime, of course, but it's about scenes and the returning to those for some reason. And in my case, all of this building up to say, I think there are some governing obsessions. One is the broadest, which I see cannot be argued to be still with me, and they're certainly at the social life of things. But even earlier to my doctoral dissertation of 1976, which was published in 1981, a kind of tediously detailed monograph on a South Indian temple, which one reviewer called both exhaustive and exhausting, and I was glad he at least added exhaustive. Throughout, the question has been culture and economy, the way it is for people, let's say, like Amartya Sen, a very giant figure, or others who are pondering, as did Marx, the question of things, value, price, markets. And in my case, that interest in how does the domain of patterns of thinking, cosmologies, meanings, all that Geertzian stuff, which we loosely call culture, fit with what we call economy, constraints, resources, material life, technology, whatever. I would say that's the overarching continuing interest. And given my birth in India, it connected to another one, which is why are countries like the one I grew up in perennially in what my dear friend and colleague Deepesh Chakravarti called the waiting room of history. We're always waiting because we are behind. But what we are behind in is some kind of economic race. And the answer, why are we behind, is usually cultural. So there we are again. It's culture and economy, and that's why we are in the waiting room of history, always trying to catch up and doomed never to do so. So these governing things, I think, still, regardless of the object of my interest, they are the driving motives, and I think the sources of both my analytic interest and my interest in what's wrong out there and what can one do about it, not just what can one study. So anyway, somewhat longish answer, but what to do.
No, that's great. It feeds into another question, which I'm sure I'm not the only one to want to ask, which is, what does Max Weber mean to you?
Well, that's of course a huge one. And of course, one of the many reasons I'm thrilled about this new link and appointment is how it's designated, which I regard as a fabulous way to indicate that I'm a dwarf on the shoulder of this giant. And this giant, Max Weber, has been severely criticized and continues to be for not understanding culture, for being some form of, let's say, too much of an economic determinist by people interested in culture, and too much of a cultural type by Marxists and so on. So he's pilloried on both sides, but he's also pilloried justifiably for a remarkable lack of interest in the whole presence of Europe in the world, namely empire. It's like, oh, I didn't notice that it's not just a matter of comparing Germany and England and capitalism with India and China and Africa. It's like, they're actually not totally independent cases for the last 200 years. So there are some strong criticisms of his blindnesses, as is true for others. But that said, I would say he's still, to me, the supremely learned thinker. And now I'll step out on a limb, anywhere, anytime, in any language of which I'm aware, to take up the question of culture and economy in incredible scholarly detail. Agrarian law in Rome. I mean, he wrote a tome on that, even before he came any miles from the study of modern Protestantism capitalism. He was a specialist in agrarian Roman law. in that same way, he knew detailed things about Chinese military recruitment in the 13th century. I mean, the compass of his learning was stunning. And that alone, of course, we can now, just say he's a kind of human Wikipedia. What's the big deal? What is the big deal is that he never ceased to position himself on the horns between the idiothetic, the idiographic, and the nomothetic. That is what in Germany became the central distinction at the time of the Neo-Kantians. We spoke about that, Peter, you and I, Windelband, Rickert. They were all riding that, bucking horse, which is how can we be true to the particulars of a time, an ethos, a text, a book, a language, and yet speak about humanity. Well, they, might be regarded as the jihadis for that question. They pulled the pin and many times just blew themselves up. They look ridiculous now, But Max Weber, for me, I mean, there were others, Zombart and so on and so forth. So he was not alone, but I would say he was the most powerful of the people who asked huge questions and then refused to just rise to some Hegelian abstract level or descend to some Rankian archival nightmare, kept the tension going. And to me, that's exemplary. And if I can do 1,000th of what he did, I'd be very proud. So that's my immediate instinctive answer to why that name means a lot to me in that person.
That was great. I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we go to the broader conversation. And that's, you can answer it at greater or lesser length, but I'm interested in how you think over the next few years your intellectual interests and those of the BGC will interact.
Yeah. So I think I can see lots of things, and of course, that's a process just beginning as I begin to learn more about the individual interests of particular faculty or specific projects or your journal or other things that will enrich my imagination, of course, and create more possibilities. But even based on what I have known in the past and what I know now in my conversations with you and ancillary conversations that has produced, is that there are two poles, both of which I think can be nourished here. One is, let's say, the basic interpretive frame for the material world, the world of things, the world of design things, which somewhere I gave as my definition of object. The object is the design thing. Things may be this and that, but so Mars may be a thing, a cabbage may be a thing, but then there are design things, and those I think of as objects. So there's, I think, a basic science or a set of fundamental questions about that, which are still, not fully understood. One example would be, if things take meaning from the other things in the environment, when does that process end? So if my tie takes meaning from my shirt from my pants, and so on and so forth, following Jonathan Culler, whom I've quoted before on the question of context, when do we draw the line? Do I have to end up with a galaxy in order to explain a tie clip? Probably not. But if I say the tie clip is a tie clip is a tie clip, then I'll miss a lot. So how does one develop a frame for judgment, not in the Kantian sense, but in some other more working sense, of where to draw the line and how important it is to go up to a certain point in locating the environment within which objects find their meaning? That to me is a sufficient question of a kind of primary nature. And there are probably a few like that. So I think my link to the Bard Graduate Center can help there. And the other end, I would say, is extremely now or present or contemporary, and that is the whole effort to the whole move to what we call a progressive iconoclasm. take down the statue, decolonize the museum, etc. So what is this about? I mean, who's it speaking to? Who's it speaking for? That's a very today question. One might even say a very New York question or a very US question. It's not clear that people in Kinshasa or Mexico City are thinking about this, but we know there's some worldwide echo of this stuff, partly because it's implicated with race and exploitation and slavery. It immediately seems connected, but I still will ask, or want to ask, why the kind of wish to take down monuments or blow up certain kinds of exhibits or cancel, as people say, certain artists or curators. What is that speaking to? Who does it really serve? In the name of what kind of humanity is that? If your concern is race or slavery, talk about that. Who gave it the upgrade? That's my question. I don't mind talking about colonialism. I grew up in a colonized country. But once, you tell me to decolonize my curriculum or my underwear, I pause and I say, well, see, how does that have to do with India in 1931? I'm not totally sure, So you can see there are very contemporary things, not only as issues, but as ethical and political questions. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? Which also pertain to things, collections, displays, exhibitions, and which are heavily now. So there's these two poles, both of which I hope to benefit from conversations with you, your colleagues, students, others.
Thank you, Arjun. That's a great place to transition to the more open playing field for conversation. Floor is open. And I have a question, mechanical hand of Ivan Gaskell.
Hello, it's great that you're joining us. I'm absolutely delighted, as we have discussed in email exchanges. My first
Indeed.
So my first question is a highly personal one, and it concerns your name. I have great friends who are from Bengal, and their son's name is the same as your first name. And they pronounce it Arjun. And I wonder how it's pronounced, because I want to get off on the right foot in terms of names.
Got you. Do you want to ask the second one, Ivan?
Yeah. The second concerns,
I'm happy to hear it.
The second is more about substance of your work. And that is, you just mentioned in your last response, you brought up museums. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on questions to do with museums. I've just read and written a review of this book.
Yeah.
The British Museums.
Oh my gosh.
And this is by a curator and professor at Oxford. He's at the Pitt Rivers Museum, named Dan Hicks. And
yes.
You know him, you know his work?
I know of the work. I don't know him, but I know people who know him, and I know about this book, which has already generated a certain amount of heat, I think.
It certainly has. Now, I'm not going to ask you about the book because that would put you on the spot.
I haven't read it, so I can't speak about it.
Yeah. So, but what I wanted to just point out, you've probably heard this, he really takes to task the whole idea of object biographies. And it's one of the things he really dislikes, along with Nick Thomas's notion of entanglement. These are his two.
He dislikes that too. He dislikes Nick.
Yeah. So
why? I'm fascinated. Why? What's the crib?
Okay, so
What's
the
the
short
complaint?
answer here is that because he
Yes.
believes that these impede the whole business of repatriation and restitution of things from museums to their original communities.
Wow.
So, yeah, he takes an extremely strong moralizing stand, and his sense of moral outrage, to my mind, just gets it dominates his thinking. So that's it in a very brief.
Yes.
So I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts as far as museums are concerned and issues of repatriation, restitution, whatever one wants to call it, whether you have some broad brush ideas or what we should be careful about when we think about these issues.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Ivan. It's great to see you after our email exchange, which itself articulated and brought to the surface an interest I've had in things you've been saying and writing on, as well as your journey to the Graduate Center and your links in Germany. So there are many things, as you know. But let me go to the first one, the name question. Arjun, my name, my first name, comes from the hero Arjuna, who's a kind of vaguely in the same taxon as Achilles. He's a kind of a good guy from our epic traditions. The interesting thing about this name, unlike many others, is it's hugely known, but not very common. I mean, it's fully recognized, so there's nothing exotic about it. Nobody say, "Oh, why'd you call your son Arjun?" But there are not 1,000 Arjuns like there are 1,000 Ashoks, Dilips. I mean, I can go on where you'd say, "Oh, is it that Ashok?" No, with Arjun, it's not that common. I still don't have an answer for that. Why not? It's short, it's sweet, it's famous, it's good, but there you are. On the Bengali front, without endangering my many friendships with people from Bengal, I have to say there's a way, just like from my part of India, Tamil Nadu, or from Punjab or whatever, there's a way in which English transcription and pronunciation reflects the Bengali way. So, O for Arjun is Bengali, the way Bengalis handle anything that starts with what I think of as an A. Arjun, Ashok, Oshok, etc. So there's a rounding or O-ing of all A's. My linguistic friends will have doubtlessly a very deep answer to what there is in Bengali transcription, pronunciation, and so on, such that what is in other places the A sound in Bengal is invariably the O sound. So I am not Arjun, I am simply Arjun. Or as the Americans might say, Arjun, or the French Arjun, etc. But it's not or. There's no or. There's an either, but there's not an or. Let's put it that way. So that's the Bengal part. I will say, in Iran, Persia, there is in Farsi a strong tendency also to do this rounding. So they will do that with things that become in Urdu and Hindi flatter, but they will tend to say ho, ho, so there's some odd other end of the subcontinent in which this happens too, but that's just a personal observation. Anyway, that's the Bengal part. I am Arjun to my friends, family, etc. The museum thing is a huge thing. I'm totally puzzled why someone like Dan Hicks could imagine that either Nick Thomas's stuff or my stuff could be an impediment. That itself, I must say, to imply any form of mobility implies understanding that mobility and implies that that mobility might be unjust and therefore needs to be corrected. So for any first grader, it should be clear that if you introduce mobility, you could have counter mobility for some ethical reasons. So I look forward to reading the book to see what tortured logic might allow somebody to say this argument about biographies or social lives or entanglement, unless he means that the minute you say something is here and now it's here, you're actually endorsing some moment and therefore saying the previous moment cannot. It's an absurdity. This is a factual description of historical processes. It's not ethical weightage that we bought a ticket on the train and so we'll only go to Calais, No, we can turn around and buy another ticket because it's a moving thing. So I can only think of various silly misunderstandings. That said, I do think the reparation question, so on Hicks, I'll read the book, but it seems strange to me. The question, as you put it very graciously, what should one be careful about? I'll say several things. One is that very thoughtful people like Ashila Mbembe, Felwine Sarr, and so on, who have been very active in this debate and made very strong statements, have also, especially Ashila Mbembe, pointed out how tricky the question of restoration, reparation, repair, etc., can be. If nothing else, because it allows things to seem resolved by the single reparation on one thing. So Ashil points out, don't do this as some kind of pound of flesh and then bugger off. Don't bother me again. Here's your stupid little statue kind of thing. There is a much deeper sense of that. And Ashil particularly said, don't go into reparation. You will never be able to do reparation. So all you can do is some movement in that direction, but don't think there's any books to be closed. They will never be closed. So there's a lot of stuff. But my own thing has been one very particular, small, niggling worry I have, leaving aside these bigger concerns and generally saying, of course, people who did severe damage to other people should be held to account and asked to respond and asked to repair, in some way, intergenerational harm. Unless you hold to the view that my harm is what I did yesterday, don't tell me about my dad, my mom, my society, my country, except when I want them. Then I'll invoke them, of course. That's the beauty of that other position. I'll invoke being German and Berlin and the Heimat and all, except when it comes to reparation, when I'm just a free guy, what are you blaming me for? So I think that's nonsensical. But I will say that the overall movement of many of these things, say from Benin to the British Museum or from Greece or whatever, occurred more or less before there were nation states either at the sending or the receiving end. There were empires at the one end and all kinds of formations at the other. So who is going to take possession? It's somebody who runs a current nation state, which may include or not include various abused populations. And that goes to one of my governing obsessions, which is the artificiality and short history of the nation form. So who's doing the deal? So it's like having a deal done by two lawyers who have nothing to do with the clients. Well, the clients are some population which made that thing, crafted that thing, which could have been 5 people or it could have been 5 million people. But it's not the current state of Senegal or Sierra Leone or whatever, or India for that matter. And the takers are not, passport holding Brits. They were part of the empire. There was some other formation. So this is not to relieve the British of accountability. It's just to say let's take into account that we're arguing and debating in a politics of proxy. I stand for that person, you stand for that person. How should we then negotiate? But everybody wants to deny the proxy plight. They say, well, it's me, it's my stuff you took. Or it's me, like the monarchy debate right now. I mean, who's the we in the British construct of who they are? I mean, the we, is it a monarchical we? It's a democratic we? So I think some concession should be made that reparation, restitution, restoration, repair, all these overlapping words, should, this is my caution, take on board that the current negotiating partners may not be taxonomically the same as the people who did either the taking or the losing. I'll leave it there. And it's a awfully long answer to a straightforward question, but it's a deep question. So
Well, that's a deep answer too. Many thanks. I think there is, of course, a difference between the situation that you're sketching there and, say, the repatriation of things under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.
Yes,
it's a different set of circumstances in a broad sense. But
I'm going to jump in because I'm sure other people will have questions.
God bless you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Arjun. So I'm the cultural anthropologist on our faculty here at Bard Graduate Center.
I know.
And I welcome you in this virtual space for now. And one of the classes that I teach here is subtitled The Anthropology of Art and Material Culture, but of course it's titled The Social Lives of Things. And when Peter shared the good news that you'd be joining us, I wondered aloud to him whether I was going to have to change the name of my course. I'm hoping that I don't, and I'm hoping that on the day
that you let me come on board with that.
Well, I'm hoping that the day we read your book, we can invite you to come and talk about it. So here's my question. My question is, in fact, about titles and subtitles, and the long tale of reception and recontextualization. So one of the things, we don't read the whole book, we read your introduction and Kopytov's essay. We talk about the difference between the social life and the cultural biography, which you mentioned in your framing comments. And then I make a point to the students, which I would now, given this great privilege, be able to ask you directly, which is that it's always been my sense that the longer the book had influence and the more it was taken up in adjacent fields and conversations, the more its own social life was extended. The narrower people's understanding of the original project became, so that what was being borrowed in many, not all cases, was this idea of life or biography, and in many cases, a complete occlusion of the original subtitle of the book, which was that it was about commodities as the particular type of things that had a life, and that this idea that one could tell
and
the
also
story
that there was a perspective which is cultural that need not be the only perspective, but it was mine.
Right.
That was also the subtitle, that you could have commodities in economic perspective, commodities in political science, but this was in cultural perspective, which is to say, so thank you for reminding me that there was a little tail to that bigger title, or the easier title.
I mean, so my question is really, do you think that's true, that particular sort of articulation that was important to you between Marx and Mauss, right? Between rethinking the commodity and keeping it in a kind of cultural perspective, that some of that was lost in the kind of uptake of the phraseology of social life and biography as the book had more and more influence.
Well, it's a wonderful question, and I thank you for the generosity of that question. And I know your training context at NYU, and if I may say, when I combine Fay and cadet, that there are Fayettes, or people who have debts to Fay, which is not to say little Fays, but people who have debts to Fay. That is Fayette.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, I know some of your teachers, colleagues, friends at NYU. So I'm on the line. I don't think we met in New York, but I'm very glad to know of that environment and very appreciative of your very sensitive reading of something which is now, more or less an object in the public domain for teaching and so on. And that's a great honor. But of course, one can't, it's not a rodeo where one can say, I don't like where that horse is. It's like it's out. Enjoy it. And I do. But I think there are two things of which you're picking up one in what might be lost, in what otherwise looks like one should just be happy, and thankful. And I am. Every time I get 5 cents from Cambridge University Press because something sold, I say, great, 20 of those and I'll have $1. I'm moving. But I haven't reflected, I have to say, until today about, are there downsides to the great circulation impact and so on, at least in the terms of our profession? When I'd like to be like Harold Robbins or, Jacqueline Suzanne, but, we know we're not in those spheres. But still, it's an influential book and one should be glad. But what is there a cost? And here's what I would say, that the focus on the movement part, social life, cultural biography, has it on both the cultural and the social in the title. So the first part is social life of things, not life of things. That could be a kind of precursory, Old Testament version of Latour. You're pointing already to Jesus. Jesus was not born, but, we knew about life, agency, and actor network theory, but we were still the Old Testament. We weren't that wise. The New Testament was yet to come. It came. But the life is not, it's a social. So what does it mean to say social in opposition to cultural? That was for me what I thought I was adding to Igor's insight. And I would say that's the thing that remains to me, not necessarily a cost of the widespread use of this book and my essay and Igor's essay, but in general, that there's, when I was trained in graduate school at Chicago with all sorts of people and wonderful thinkers, this was considered a tension, and a huge one. What do we call social? Why do we call this course a course in social structure and that course a course in cultural something or the other? What's the tension? Someone like Geertz, whom I worship, and who's also a much bigger dwarf on the shoulders of Weber, always had this issue. Like his article on the Javanese funeral was about the gap. You may remember this. He has an article, 1973, in that Interpretation of Cultures, called something on a Javanese funeral, and it was about the gap between cultural and social change. And he's a brilliant guy, so he saw there was some kind of time problem. So I'm into that, and I think in a very short way, I'll just say, with this huge build-up, that to me, there are issues, productive issues in the tension between cultural and social as adjectives, or culture and society as nouns, which are lost sometimes when people are into the life part or the movement part or the biography part. So that's, again, a somewhat bland way to put it, but that's where I'll take your thought.
Thank you.
Peter, I'm consuming a lot of airtime, valuable airtime, with my sluggish answers to each of these wonderful questions.
Sluggish or thoughtful, I mean, people can choose their own.
There are thoughtful slugs.
Yeah, so we have time for, I think, another question or two before we have to formally switch to the informal part. I see, Jen, you have a mechanical hand?
Yes, thank you, Arjun, and welcome to the BGC. I am the materials engineer here, but I have a question actually about architecture. I was really interested in the comment that you made about how this post-colonial moment is maybe a New York City experience and not so much a Kinshasa experience. And that led me to think about what's happening right now in Jakarta as a result of the Dutch colonization of Jakarta and the Dutch architecture that's grown up in that city, which is that Jakarta is sinking. And this is the result, of course, of environmental changes, and finding that the colonial architecture of Jakarta is particularly poorly suited to the climate change that we're occurring. And we see that happen.
I didn't know about this at all. This is stunning. Wow.
And so, yeah, I thought that was one example. Architecture, not just in Indonesia, but also in Africa. We see it also in the American South, where the colonial architecture versus the indigenous architecture are really fighting each other, and it's the indigenous architecture that's surviving. And I was curious about if you had seen other examples of that in your work in other parts of the world.
Well, thank you very much. And this is a fascinating subject. It's somewhat, I'm more of a kind of tourist or consumer of this stuff. I know people who worked on Indonesia. I even know of some authors who worked actually on colonial architecture in Indonesia, a couple of people who've written for public culture and so on over the years, but also people like John Pemberton and, anthropologists who are generally sensitive to what's happening in Indonesia. But what you say poses a very big question, which is that, of course, colonialism, imperial rule, Dutch, French, British, Portuguese, Spanish, though that Latin world has got some twists of its own. But let's just talk of the last 2-3 centuries or so, which are these empires, the Dutch, the French, the British, and a few others, in almost the whole of the world, outside of Latin America, outside of the Caribbean, part of Latin America, but really almost everywhere else, have this notion of what they do in almost any regard, which is captured in a book titled by a friend, a senior colleague, I'm not sure where he is. Is he alive? Is he still writing? Called Frank Hutchins, which was about British colonial rule. And it had a title I've never forgotten. It's The Illusion of Permanence. It's not The Future of an Illusion, which is the other great figure, but it was The Illusion of Permanence. And I think your examples catches it. We found this material. It's going to last forever. And that was true of colonial materials then. It's true of cement now. Of course it'll last forever, right? Until the Mississippi takes it down, So we know that this whole business in New Orleans has proved to be a bankrupt thing with the army building, these levees and so on. It's a farce. The Mississippi has been moving over 1,000-mile stream or map over centuries. And you think you're going to build a 50-foot levee with the US Army and contain the damn thing? No way. So I'm totally with you. The harder question is whether materials of other periods and regimes and cultural cosmologies and so on has done a hell of a lot better. Mud, thatch, and so on. And there's terrific housing and other documentation of these non-imperial, non-modern materials from big places, little places, out of the way places. The question is this for me, not, are they any good? Of course, they're great. They are highly suited. They're based on locally available things. They are environmentally smart. The question is, what happens when they encounter a more nasty history? In other words, what's their resilience then? So I can be resilient if somebody only asks me about the anthropology of India from 1960 to 1970. I'm super resilient. But if somebody says, you know, Arjun, how about all of social anthropology for those centuries? And I say, that means my anthropology is not that bloody resilient. So we can say, I should not be subjected to that. History is cruel. Well, yes, history is cruel. So resilience for me also means when you're faced with depredation, with exploitation, with this and that, do you have solutions which still hang in? Bamboo might be one of those. But there are others that don't hold up so well. And I'm not saying they should be tested this way, but you know, I'm not in charge of history. It happens, and then some things work better, last longer. So that's why I don't want to put indigenous material styles and so on a pedestal, because even they, you know, are products of history and respond well or less, a very generic or general answer, but it's a promissory note for more conversation.
Thank you.
And that's a good note on which to pause. I know it's past 1:15, people have to go to class or other things that we start again at 1:30. So this is our formal endpoint. Those who want to linger and ask more questions are certainly welcome to do so until we're kicked off the space, but I wanted to let people go, and before doing that, to thank Arjun for the conversation of the past hour, and to wish him and us this as a foretaste of conversations to come. So thank you very much formally, and to all of you, our guests and visitors today also, thank you.
Thank you, Peter.